Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The American Slave Coast, A History of Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 32, which is titled Democratizing Capital. And it starts with a quote from former President Andrew Jackson in his farewell address in 1837, who said, I leave this great people prosperous and happy. The upward trend of the American economy accelerated further, and again, New York was in the lead. When Governor DeWitt Clinton's great public works project, which was the Erie Canal, opened on October 26, 1825. Consolidating the power of New York City as a trade center, it was an audacious engineering feat that connected the Hudson River with the far western reaches of the country and tied New York State together by means of commercial waterway. The Erie Canal project needed as many people as it could hire. It was an economic stimulus even while it was being built, lifting all boats, so to speak, before the locks were even in operation. The interesting note here is that public works projects are stimulus packages because they employ people to get the work done. Whatever skills or labor a worker could offer was useful in such a massive undertaking. Calculating, carpentry, cooking, driving mules, ditch digging. The people who lived in the area also prospered by selling the laborers food, liquor, clothes, lodging, and other services. It was one of the young country's proudest to do moments. In the 8 years it took to build, the canal employed some 9,000 wage laborers, many of them Irish, but also included free black laborers, including some from Saratoga, New York. The young Solomon Northup, later the author of the book 12 Years a Slave. The Erie Canal was not built by slave labor. This was what non-slave economies could do. And indeed, by 1827, slavery ended in New York following a good period of gradual emancipation, providing the culmination of what some historians call the first emancipation, that of the North. So what the author is saying is that New York found that it was easier to lift up its white peasant class than it was cheaper to uplift its white peasant class, the Irish at the time, than it was to employ slave labor, and that it made good business sense for them. The 360-mile Erie Canal supplied an unprecedented level of infrastructural improvement, connecting the vast land beyond the Great Lakes via the Lake Erie port of Buffalo and the state capital of Albany on the Hudson River, which ran 150 miles or so down to New York City. By making it practical to get wheat from the western part of the state to New York's harbor for export, the canal caused the value of New York State's agricultural land to appreciate sharply, even as it created a path for distribution of finished goods from New York into the far interior. And it was on a toll road on which New York got paid coming and going. Because it was the only northern channel that crossed the Appalachians, it instantly became the major route to market for farmers and home manufacturers across a large territory. So, as you can see, again, a public works project is something to lift up the economy. Fast growing New York City had been overtaken by Havana in population sometime in the 1810s. Now, the Erie Canal, together, together with New York's control of the Liverpool route and its Wall Street stock market, made the city definitively the number one commercial center in the United States. It caused a massive appreciation of property values as far as West Chicago, which in the early 1830s was the subject of a tremendous real estate boom based on its position as a hub for water transportation. Goods from St. Louis and the Northwest could now be brought to market via Chicago and New York instead of New Orleans. By 1836, the state of Illinois was digging a canal to connect Chicago directly to the Mississippi River, though it did not open until 1848. Private capital had been insufficient to build the Erie Canal. It was a project of New York State, financed without levying taxes. The state sold bonds, and happily for the investors, they were easily paid back by the toll receipts the state collected. Every state wanted that kind of success. In Maryland, the 91-year-old Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence and the wealthiest man in Maryland, whose family's industrial arc had gone in two generations from a colonial pig iron to Republican railroads, turned over the first spade of earth on the Baltimore and Ohio, the nation's first common carrier railroad, in 1828. That's where the Monopoly game gets the B&O Railroad name from. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The mania for infrastructural improvement seized the nation, but the political class of the South was dead set against this kind of project. It would be a bad precedent for the labor regime of slavery if the federal government paid large numbers of free people to work. They were rentiers living off their capital, and their capital was also their labor. If anything was to be built in their territory, they wanted it built by slaves rented from them. And they certainly didn't want improvements elsewhere to be paid for by taxes or tariffs on them. Henry Clay's American system of federally sponsored improvements, which counted among its successes the Second Bank of the United States and the National Road, was hated by Southern politicians and had been definitively stopped. With Andrew Jackson in the White House as of March 4th, 1829, everyone knew that an extreme shift to limited federal government was about to begin. Jacksonian rhetoric had freely leveled the charge of corruption against Adams, Clay, and the Bank of the United States. But Jackson's party was utterly corrupt. His campaign had freely promised governmental positions in exchange for support. And once in office, his administration began purging public employees, especially postmasters, in order to replace them with political hacks or political loyalists in what became known as the spoils system. Does that sound familiar? Trump is doing that today. Jackson continued the job of exiling Native Americans conducted with the accustomed attitude of patronizing benevolence in the Native negotiators who were expected to, and some did, address him as father. So Andrew Jackson wanted the Native Americans to address him as father and refer to themselves as your children as he took their homeland away. The urgency of the process was accelerated by a minor discovery of gold in Georgia in 1829. Along with a number of other Native American groups, The so-called five civilized tribes or nations, which were the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole, still inhabited the region. Jackson in 1830 signed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized him to quote unquote negotiate for them to leave. A series of treaties were signed, and the first deportations began in 1831. During the decade, perhaps as many as 100,000 Native Americans were removed or kicked out or forcibly removed and taken away from their land westward in the Trail of Tears. Evicting them was a moneymaker. Politically connected businessmen would receive a $10,000 contract for Indian removal, which gave them an incentive to do it cheaply. The forced migration had perhaps a 15% mortality rate, which was about the same as the transatlantic slave ships. And indeed, much of the travel was by water along river routes. More than 300 Creeks died on the night of October 31st, 1837, when the steamboat Monmouth was carrying them, collided with another vessel, and sank. The Seminoles, not the black Seminoles, but the Indian Seminoles, some of whom were black, did not leave. And in 1835, a war began that lasted 7 years. After the capture of Seminole chief Osceola, whose heritage was part Creek and part English and Scottish Irish, was imprisoned in the old Spanish citadel at St. Augustine, then called Fort Marion, and then moved to Fort Moultrie on Sullivan Island, South Carolina. No sooner had Native Americans withdrawn from a spot than a town sprang up. Expansion onto the formerly occupied lands that Jackson had taken went as fast as the credit system would allow. Some 80% of the Chickasaw succession of the 1830s, sold at cheap public land office, passed through the hands of speculators. So these people didn't even want to keep the land. These were just people acquiring the land so that they could resell it to other people. The economic storm that raged during the 8 years of Jackson's presidency and for another decade or so afterwards drew its energy from a variety of sources. At the eye of it was Jackson, who opened up credit as wide as it would go and threw away the controls. The economy had been subject to the characteristic cycles of capitalism all along, of course, but the bubble of the 1830s was spectacular. Fueled by a conjecture of forces, international and domestic, it took the slave trade to new heights. The boom and bust of the 1830s took place in the context of a radical economic experiment in decentralization and deregulation, in which President Jackson took a wrecking ball to the economy's financial structure, restructured it to operate without oversight, definitively abrogated a national role in the issuance of paper money, and then shocked the system with abrupt rule changes. This was not to say that other crises would not have occurred had he not done that. But what did happen was the Panic of 1837, which led to the most severe depression in American history until the Panic of 1929. And we're about to hit a panic as well. As you can see, as forecast said, history repeats itself. History repeats itself over and over and over again. About every 100 years, they get these same ideas that come up. These ideas that didn't work 100 years ago, these ideas that didn't work 200 years ago, even when they had control of all the capital and all the labor and we were enslaved, these ideas never worked. It is ironic that in the name of a man as autocratic as Andrew Jackson is associated with the word democracy, Jacksonian democracy, the great trope of American history, grew out of and expanded the reach of that other great trope, Jeffersonian democracy. Jacksonians were loudly faithful to the many ideals of the Jeffersonians, but whereas Jefferson imagined an agrarian rural republic of franchised property owners, Jacksonian democracy incorporated poor white men. The yeomanry of the Western frontier and the towns, the kind of person Jackson himself had been, into the franchise, thus promoting caste solidarity among white men of all classes at the expense of blacks. So Jackson was key in spearheading white supremacy in America during his time because he integrated the poor white man, the low class white man, the one who was uncultured and unlearned into the voting system. Indeed, it implicitly promised to poor whites that being enslavable, they might someday become slave owners, especially with so much land and credit available cheaply. Enfranchising them invested them in white supremacy. Jacksonian democracy promoted white caste solidarity at the expense of Black personhood. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're learning about how Andrew Jackson helped helped codify white supremacy by integrating the poor whites into the voting system. Riches had never flown around so fast. Slavery could be incredibly profitable, especially when there were plenty of virgin Western land available and an unquenchable market for cotton that yielded cash returns as soon as slave labor could be applied to formerly native land. The forecast says he was just talking about Andrew Jackson and Ulysses S. Grant. Exactly. Exactly. But even a project for a racist democracy, or as Sean Willens called it, master race democracy, Jacksonian democracy had little appeal to the patriarchs of South Carolina. They were uninterested in democracy of any sort. They formed a separate power block from Jackson, who in many ways represented political continuity with the old Virginia dynasty. So, what he's saying is that even among white people, the established wealthy whites who were propertied, landed in the gentry, who were propertied and landed, excuse me, still had no interest in mixing with the poor whites. It is also ironic that Jackson's picture is on the $20 bill because Jackson hated rag money and wanted to get rid of it. Unfortunately, as his administration set out to, the humorist Joseph Glover Baldwin satirically put in a memoir of the era, Democratized Capital, Jackson's actions made paper money less reliable than it ever had been, made government more economically inefficient, and drove the South to rely more on its human savings accounts. So it's ironic that Jackson is on the money because Jackson actually didn't believe in the money system and he drove the people in the South, the old money, to rely more on their enslaved population as money. Jackson was a hard money man. John Quincy Adams described Jackson's final presidential message as containing an abundance of verbiage about gold and silver and the injustice of bank paper to the laboring poor. Jackson would have liked silver coins to have been physically exchanged for every transaction, like when he sold slaves for silver in Spanish Natchez. There wasn't enough coin for the transactions of an expanding nation, but never mind that. Jackson hated paper money, banks, and debt, a point of view that was understandable from a small town merchant, but disastrous when applied to a nation's economic system. Jackson especially hated Henry Clay, whose party was for a time called the Anti Jackson Party. In a coalition with the Adams followers, they became the Whigs, with Clay as their losing presidential candidate in 1832. In what has been remembered as the second party system, these two main parties and a welter of smaller ones attempted to be national parties, connecting the North and South. That was an attempt to straddle the fundamental dividing line of American politics, which was overwhelmingly slavery versus free soil. In both cases, making a national party required accommodating the slavery interest. Anti slavery people in the North were growing in number, while Southern delegates grew steadily less interested in compromise. The Whigs, who came in slave owning and anti slavery varieties, were modernizers, most merchants were Whigs in favor of banks and corporations, federally sponsored internal improvements, protective tariffs, and national currency regulation, what we would now call big government or the liberals. And as you can see, even in their beginnings, they had slave owning and anti slavery varieties. Anthony McPhail says, Happy Veterans Day to the 179,000 African soldiers who fought and freed us from enslavement during the American Civil War. Absolutely. Democrats who saw all this as tyranny were in favor of states' rights, limited government, an agrarian republic, hard money, and were for the most part aggressively or reluctantly pro-slavery, though there were anti-slavery Jacksonian Democrats as well. Modern Americans are accustomed to thinking of Mississippi as the poorest of the 50 states. But in 1831, when it was growing explosively with new plantations amid a land grab and slave boom, it had, in Biddle's words, more rich proprietors than anywhere else assembled. Mississippi was the hottest lending location in the country. So in the spring of 1831, the Second Bank of the United States opened a branch, its last one as it turned out, in Natchez. The bank was not merely a presence in Natchez, it was aggressive, at one point concentrating 10% of its resources there. The bank's arrival transformed the state's credit hungry business environment. It was the legally mandated depository of federal funds, receiving federal income as it came in. By marketing federal debt to state and private banks, it controlled the money supply. It was far bigger than any state chartered bank, and it kept something of a lid on the state banks by accepting their notes. Discounting, it was called, reflecting the percentage adjustments that had to be made when using paper obligations and immediately redeeming them for specie. It thus acted as a kind of regulator on how much paper the state banks could issue. Its national reach allowed it to move liquidity around and help keep the entire system flowing smoothly. Biddle called it a commercial railroad. It was the main channel of exchange at the national level. The bank was not unpopular, and it was powerful politically, being at the center of multiple webs of patronage, something Jacksonians wanted to monopolize. The paper money it issued could be exchanged for specie at any time at any one of the bank's national branches. But in fact, it was not necessary to do so because the paper was known to be high quality and was easily accepted by everyone, including slave traders. Anthony McPhail says Natchez, Mississippi was a major slave depot. Yes, it was. It's where Andrew Jackson made his wealth and his riches traveling up and down the river from Natchez to Tennessee to make his wealth. As competition from the bank's new Mississippi branch forced the already existing State Bank of Mississippi, which was later called the Agricultural Bank, toward what would ultimately be liquidation, another bank appeared in the state, the Planters Bank. The Mississippi State Legislature had chartered it in 1830, disregarding a state pledge made at the time of the first bank's charter to not charter another bank. It was theoretically capitalized at $4 million, half of it subscribed to by the state and paid for with 6% state bonds. Its charter promised to, by a creation of revenue, relieve the citizens of the state from an oppressive burden of taxes and enable them to realize the blessings of a correct system of internal improvement. Except for the national bank's notes, all paper money was local money, and negotiating it anywhere but its place of issuance was much like doing a foreign exchange transaction today. As hundreds of banks appeared with licenses to print money, they all wanted to get as much of the money they printed into the public hands as possible, crowding the other banks' papers out. Can you imagine a time where every bank is printing their own different type of money and there's no standard? As the two state banks of Mississippi competed with the national bank to write mortgages, it was never easier to buy slaves on terms or on credit. The Natchez slave market soared, with Louisiana closed to out of state dealers in the wake of Nat Turner. The competition in Mississippi heated up. The bank's bulging loan portfolios were capitalized largely by slaves who trudged down into Mississippi in coffle after coffle. And remember, coffle is a nice, neat word, but it doesn't explain the horror of what happened being chained less than 2 feet from the person in front of you, walking often naked and barefoot across various terrains, shitting and pissing and throwing up, and some even dying in those chains as they were marched across the land. Both sides of the presidential election of 1832 made the bank their major campaign issue. The bank's 20-year charter was set to expire in 1836, but in the face of Jackson's harassment of it and the urging of Clay and Daniel Webster, Biddle, the bank's president, proposed a recharter in 1832, gambling that Jackson would not dare kill it with the presidential election coming up, sneering at one point that the worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he may have his way with the bank. He was mistaken. It was a bad idea to call Andrew Jackson's bluff. We have previously noted Andrew Jackson's capacity for hatred. When Jackson hated, it was not only who he hated, it was the popular movement of hate sanctioned by God, and it was a political mechanism of hate. To hate Whigs was to hate the Second Bank of the United States, which aligned with them to the point of having financially supported Henry Clay, who, for his part, had the bad idea of making the bank recharter an election issue. Moreover, Jackson's first falling out with the now enemy Calhounites had been over the issue of the bank, which they supported. Destroying was what Andrew Jackson did best, and destroying the Second Bank of the United States was his obsession. Jackson saw the bank as a federally sanctioned private monopoly. But whatever his ideological reasons for hating it were, there was perhaps a more basic reason. It was the most powerful institution in the United States not under his control, and that alone was enough to seal its doom. The bank's recharter passed Congress, but was boldly vetoed by Jackson 1 week later, who issued an economically incoherent veto message authored by his bank hating advisor and political fixer, Amos Kendall, that stoked sectional rivalries, not simply South against North, but positioning Jackson on the side of good, West versus the bad East. Understood to be associated with the South and the North, respectively, that it is obvious that the debt of the people in that section of the bank is principally debt to the Eastern and foreign stockholders, that the interest they pay upon it is carried into the Eastern states and into Europe, and that it is a burden upon their industry and a drain of their currency. So, what he's saying is that this didn't benefit those people. This only benefited the East Coast and foreign nations. And because of that, he was against it. So he was trying to put a political spin on it, but really and truly, he hated them because they supported his opponents. And they were an institution that was big and powerful, and he didn't have control over it. Does this remind you of anyone that's in power today? While Jackson was staring down the bank, he also went up against the political chiefs of South Carolina. 4 days after the veto, he signed the Tariff of 1832, or as South Carolina politicians call it, the Tariff of Abominations. It was a laundry list of protectionisms with something for New England and something for the mid Atlantic states. It had proved a vote getter for Jackson nationally, who needed to shore up his political base in the North. The slaveholding regions saw it as a tax on them. Many in the South were not opposed merely to this specific tariff, but to tariffs in general, seeing them as a tribute extorted by the North in a situation where the South produced the wealth, but the North took all the profits. In Mississippi, where nothing was manufactured and everything had to be imported, a writer to the Woodville, Mississippi Democrat lamented that there are 10 spinning wheels and 2 looms in the county. Such a thing as a sleigh, harness, shuttle, or spindle is unknown. And if we want one, we either must send to Yankeetown for them, and if we want one of either, we must send to Yankeetown for them. So, what he's saying is that they had intrastate tariffs where they taxed each other on merchandise and goods. And they had to go to the northern and the northern states and the East Coast to obtain all of their goods and services. For South Carolina politicians, Jackson's signing of the tariff was a blunt dismissal of their political importance. They resisted with a level of virulence and extreme rhetoric that astonished other congressmen. Indeed, the vehemence of their discontent was not entirely rational, unless it was understood that the point of it was polarization. The tariff was a smokescreen issue with which ambitious politicians hoped to focus Southerners' anger in order to drive a wedge against the North, with the ultimate ending of fomenting disunion, provoking confrontation. For 2 years or so, Calhoun had been promoting a doctrine of nullification that he had formalized, taking the name from Jefferson's 1798 Kentucky resolutions. In Calhoun's vision, a state had the right to nullify a federal law within its borders, which also meant that the federal government had no right to impose tariffs. Never mind that the federal revenue depended on tariffs, that was the idea. Big slave owners wanted a powerless federal government. George McDuffie from near the Georgia border, who had been taken from labor in the blacksmith shop by Mr. Calhoun to become a landed cotton planter and Calhoun's loyal political lieutenant, was the grim-faced oratorical star of the 1832 South Carolina Nullification Convention. McDuffie, who was known to be irritable because of the painful wounds dueling had left him, had come up with something retroactively called by the 40 bale theory, which held that a 40% tariff equaled taking away 40 bales of cotton for every 100 a planter produced. That was utter nonsense, but it had the advantage of simplicity and that the Calhounites used the aggressive messaging technique that in more recent times has been known as repeat it until it's true. The succession was threatened in congressional debates. Reprints of apocalyptic worded speeches charged Representative John Reed of Massachusetts, who said, were dispersed thick as autumn's leaves through the whole region of the South, with the other incendiary tracts, all calculated, if not intended to rouse the whole South to madness. We were told in this hall that the protective system of tariffs was a vampire by which the North was sucking the warm blood of the South, that the free states were prairie wolves gorging their jaws by instinct in the blood of the South, whilst oppression, robbery, and plunder were sounded to every note of their gamut. Is the result surprising? The argument over the tariff was in part a clash of factions in Jackson's government. Van Buren, who was Jackson's favorite successor, had devised the tariff. Vice President John C. Calhoun made killing it his mission. As vice president under Adams, Calhoun had, in 1827, cast the deciding vote in Senate to kill a tariff, condemning it as a sectional measure designed to impoverish the slave South. In Manisha Sinha's words, but it was hard for Calhoun to stay ahead of the pack of radicals at home who were pushing him to the right. William C. Davis describes their objectives as to defeat protectionism and contain the growth of central power in Washington, which was pretty much the same thing as maintaining the political power of slavery. As always, the dynamics of South Carolina were different. In much of the rest of the country, the voting franchise had been expanded, but not in South Carolina, where a two-party system was barely taking root, and where, as Sean Willens put it, they had no use for democratic dogma that appeared to be sweeping the rest of the nation. Calhoun, who was Jackson's backstabbing former ally, had become his open enemy, both socially after Calhoun's wife, Fluoride, ostracized Peggy Eaton, the wife of another cabinet member, and politically after President Jackson belatedly learned that Calhoun had worked against him in the cabinet during his Florida conquest. Like Clay, Webster, and Benton, Calhoun had seen himself as a contender for the presidency. By now, it was clear that would never happen. But he could be president of an independent Southern nation if one were to exist. As a senator, Calhoun could more effectively promote nullification. He was appointed by the Senate to the Senate by the state of South Carolina's legislature. The state didn't have to bother of a popular vote. On December 12th, he resigned the now almost powerless office of the vice president on December 28, 1832, finalizing his break with Jackson. The South Carolina legislature, meanwhile, passed a bill that committed South Carolina to raising a military force to resist the tariff. Calhoun insisted that nullification did not necessarily mean succession, but then again, it might. As he started a short lived nullifier party, the thrilling idea of succession would make it the most belligerent politicians of South Carolina into rulers of a sovereign state, as they insisted they already were, was in the air. Not all of South Carolina was in favor of nullification, but Unionists were derided and intimidated. Cinna writes that the election campaign of 1832 was the bloodiest in the state's history. Duels, which were usually personal affairs of honor, became the stuffs of politics. South Carolina went it alone. Even in Mississippi, the nullifiers lost. Many years later, after Martin Van Buren had pivoted around to an anti-slavery stance, he wrote of the nullification standoff that a more alarming crisis in the affairs of this country had never existed since the establishment of her independence. But the nullifiers overplayed their hand when they went up against Jackson. He was pro states' rights, but as the last president to have personally suffered the violence of the War of Independence, he was a Union man until death. He denounced nullification in a ringing proclamation in December 1832, written by Secretary of State Edward Livingston, capitalizing on his immense personal popularity. So he was a populist, like someone else we know, and vowing to use 50,000 troops if necessary to enforce the law. So he believed in lawfare, like someone else we know. Jackson rallied the country to his side, state by state, leaving South Carolina completely isolated. It almost came to the point of an armed intra Southern clash. According to Van Buren, Jackson was ready to get on a horse and personally direct an invasion of South Carolina, using Upper South troops to take out the Calhounites, saying he had at this time an inclination to go himself with a sufficient force, which he felt assured he could raise in Virginia and Tennessee as a posse comitatus of the marshal and arrest messengers. Calhoun, Robert Hayne, James Hamilton, and George McDuffie, in the midst of a force of 12,000 men, which the legislature of South Carolina had authorized to be raised and deliver them to the judicial power of the United States to be dealt with according to law. So he wanted to arrest his political enemies, and he wanted them to be basically put before the courts as if they had been really insurrectionists. South Carolina backed down. Jackson, who later expressed regret that he had not hung Calhoun when he had the chance, was reelected president in 1832 by a landslide. In the wake of the nullification of nullification, a compromise tariff bill passed what would have given South Carolina a climb down from the failure of its insurrectionist posture by reducing tariff rates slowly. In the congressional debate over that bill, Representative Nathan Appleton, who was one of the founders of the New England textile industry and of the manufacturing center of Lowell, Massachusetts, was one of America's heaviest domestic cotton customers and one of Boston's richest men. He asked point blank, "Does the South really wish the continuance of the Union? I have no doubt of the attachment of the mass of people of the South to the Union, as well as every other section of the country. But it may well be doubted whether certain leading politicians have not formed bright visions of a Southern Confederacy. This would seem to be the only rational ground for accounting for the movements in South Carolina. A Southern Confederacy of which South Carolina could be the central state and Charleston the commercial emporium may present some temptations for individual ambition." 2 days before the beginning of his second term, on March 2nd, 1833, Jackson signed the compromise tariff that Southern legislators had voted for. But he also signed the Revenue Collection Act that Northern legislators had voted for, known in South Carolina as the Force Act. It allowed him to use the military to collect tariffs and close any port he desired. Though the South Carolina legislature passed an act nullifying the Force Act in South Carolina, there was no armed insurrection against the federal government this time. The experience left South Carolina more isolated and its politics even more extreme than before. "I have had a laborious task here, but nullification is dead," wrote President Jackson in a letter on May 1st, 1833. Continuing, and its actors and exciters will only be remembered by the people who will be execrated for their wicked designs to sever and destroy the only good government on the globe. The nullification struggle had been over the tariff of abominations, not slavery. But nullification was thoroughly identified with slavery and succession. And the crisis had been a rehearsal for leaving the Union, as Jackson saw clearly. The letter continued with his much quoted observation that the tariff was only the pretext and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the Negro or the slavery question. For Jackson, as for Nathan Appleton and many other contemporary observers, the issue was the personal ambition of Calhoun and his argumentative countrymen. Martin Van Buren's autobiography describes Jackson stretched on a sick bed, a specter of physical appearance, holding my hand in one of his own and passing the other through his white locks. He said, with the clearest indication of a mind composed and in a tone entirely devoid of passion or bluster, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Stopping the bank's recharter wasn't enough for Jackson. The hydra of corruption is only scotched, not dead, wrote James K. Polk on December 16, 1832, after learning of Biddle's plans to reintroduce a charter. In response, Jackson drove a stake through the bank's heart to make sure the money power, as he called it in 1837 in his farewell address, was dead. The bank's charter would be in force until 1836, but in September of 1833, after two consecutive secretaries of Treasury had resigned rather than announce that the federal government would no longer deposit its funds in the bank, Jackson's new Secretary of Treasury, Roger B. Taney, did it. At the time Jackson killed the bank, it was operating 25 branches throughout the nation, though its operations in New England were much less significant because New England had a powerful banking system already in place. Jackson was the first president of whom we can speak of as having managers, and there was a political payoff in destroying the bank for one of them, New York's Martin Van Buren. Wall Street was happy. The bank had been the last remaining power base of Philadelphia in U.S. finance. Jackson and Van Buren's successful building of a national Democratic Party was thus accomplished as a business alliance between slavery capitalism in the South and finance capitalism in the North. So they married these two capitalistic ideas to have this baby called the Democratic Party, which is why, at its core, the Democratic Party is not for Black people. Forecasting is that Trump and Jackson seem the same to him. Absolutely, they are. In vetoing the bank's recharter, Jackson abrogated the federal government's authority over paper money. He had hoped to do away with the state banks next, but with the national bank gone, there was no alternative to state banks. But since the Constitution specifically denied states the right to issue bills of credit, that only left private banks to print money. For the next 30 years, the United States had no uniform currency as commercial institutions printed massive, uncontrolled emissions of paper money. The privatization of the money supply determined the commercial contours of the following decades until the succession of the South provoked a new assertion of federal power by the Lincoln administration. So they was just printing money like crazy all over the place, however they pleased, for whatever reason they pleased. Sound familiar? John Quincy Adams, whom Jackson defeated in the 1828 presidential election, was elected to Congress in 1830, the only ex president to take such a step, and began a remarkable second career. His diary, which he began keeping at the age of 12 in 1779 and maintained for 69 years until his death in 1849, is the most extensive of any American historical figure and is a gripping record of the times and of a conscience. As it makes clear, he had always been anti slavery, but as one of the major figures in increasing the territorial reach of the United States, he had been known as a pro expansion president rather than an anti slavery one. On his first day in Congress, however, December 12th, 1831, only months after the Nat Turner Rebellion and Uprising, he took advantage of his appointment as committee chair to present 15 petitions signed numerously by citizens of Pennsylvania praying for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and had one of them read aloud. It drove the Southerners in Congress mad. From then on, Adams delighted in presenting all the anti slavery positions he received, from the time he entered the House until he collapsed at his desk in 1848, remaining in the Capitol until he died 3 days later. No one in the U.S. government opposed slavery more consistently or effectively. Adams saw Jackson's shuttering of the bank as a baby with a loaded gun scenario, writing in dismay. His experiment is to stake the revenue, the credit, and the currency of the country upon the state banks. Petitions and even deputations came in from around the country. No, don't do this. They have all had interviews with the president, wrote Adams, who treated them all politely but declared his irrevocable determination never to consent with the restoration of the deposits and never to assent to the chartering of a Bank of the United States. I want you to note here that he says he treated them all politely. And don't people talk about how charming Trump is in one on one meetings? So, do you think that he was studied, or the people around him that created his character studied some of these historical figures and then implemented them in him in attempts to recreate a president or a mythic character in Trump? Slave trader Jordan M. Saunders approved of Jackson's action, writing his business partner, David Burford, on September 28, 1833. We are looking out for hard times in the money market on account of the anticipated removal of the government deposits. The small fries are quaking. For my part, I glory in the old Cox, or in Jackson's, inflexible determination to rid the country of a growing evil. The bank's charter was to extend until 1836, but Jackson didn't wait until then to stop the flow of federal deposits to it. The federal government began depositing its tariff revenues into 23 non networked state banks. A number later expanded to 60, and then to 93, and then to fewer and fewer as so many of them failed. Referred to by Jackson's numerous industries enemies as pet banks, they were tools of the Jacksonian Democratic Party's immense patronage machine, with which Jackson put the financial power of the federal government at the service of his political party. Biddle had maintained a conservative 2-to-1 paper to specie ratio in the bank. But these new banks, these wildcat banks as they were called, issued 4, 5, 10 times as much paper money as they had in specie to back it. Sometimes they didn't have specie at all, just other banks' paper. Biddle responded to Jackson's choke order by pursuing policies consistent with liquidation, contracting credit sharply at all the bank's branches, calling in loans and redeeming notes from state banks around the country, leading predictably enough to a panic in early 1834. Many criticized Biddle as trying to make the economy scream in a contest of wills, but his actions were consistent with Jackson's order. In Mississippi, the Bank of the United States strained the Planters Bank's resources locally by taking away a major local source of credit and calling in its notes at the time. The Planters Bank became one of the few depositors for federal funds, but unfortunately, when it finally received the first federal deposits, which came later than expected, only a small percentage of the funds was in U.S. banknotes or specie. A vast amount was in the paper of the banks of Tennessee and Alabama, while the largest portion consisted of notes issued by the Planters Bank itself. That means that they didn't have anything to back up this money, and the money that they were getting back was money that they had printed, which means it had no real value. It didn't add anything to their deposits because it's money that they had circulated. The government receipts that were being deposited were mostly revenues from the sale of public lands, which were being paid for increasingly in worthless paper. Along with this, as a government depository, the Planters Bank also had the responsibility of paying out governmental obligations. If a government employee got paid with paper in Natchez, he no longer received paper from the National Bank, redeemable for silver coins at any branch in the United States. Instead, he got Planters Bank money, which, if he tried to use it in, say, New Orleans, would only be accepted at a discount from its face value. So the money depreciated as it traveled because it was issued through state banks. Money, which had been moving in the direction of becoming a national commodity, became newly provincialized. Now that there was no national bank, and with lots of virgin land on the market, whose new owners were in the market for slaves, the newly flush pet banks began competing aggressively to write mortgages. Meanwhile, state legislatures began granting bank charters freely as new operators got into the business. Against a backdrop of general inflation, that was acutely felt by the increasing numbers of urban poor in the North, demand in Mississippi for slaves spiked while supply remained constant. Several bumper crops of cotton in a row have been sold into a growing industrial market in Britain. The British textile industry was continuing to expand, and there had been bumper crops of wheat in Britain, so domestic consumers, who provided about one half of the market for British textiles, were relatively flush. Industrial capacity was growing. Power looms in Britain grew from 14,500 in 1820 to about 100,000 in 1833, 13 years later. Even as they were growing in size and becoming more efficient, the full bore of the Industrial Revolution, which was creating wealth on a previously unknown scale, had enormous capacity to consume cotton. The French also bought American cotton, as did Lowell, Massachusetts, though its textile industry was tiny compared to the British juggernaut. Writing in humorous hyperbole, Joseph G. Baldwin later recalled Mississippi during these flush times, saying, "Emigrants came flocking in from all quarters of the Union, especially from slaveholding states. Money, or what passed for money, was the only cheap thing to be had. The state banks were issuing their bills by the sheet like a patent steam printing press its issues, and no other showing was asked of the applicant for the loan than an authentication of his great distress for money. Under this stimulating process, prices rose like smoke. In these times, there was a double incentive to buy large numbers of slaves. One, those in possession of cotton growing lands could make big money fast if only they could get enough labor. And two, the most obvious way to capture and store the value of easy money flying by was to lock it down in the form of slaves before it devalued. So, as you can see, the only way they could hold on to the value that they were acquiring was to buy slaves. In these times, there was a double incentive. In Britain, a frantic dance of the millions took place in the great ballrooms of the economy. London, with its huge financial centers, Liverpool, the shipping emporium, and Lancashire, the industrial capital, all dancing as fast as they could, taking in cotton and turning out cloth for the world. As Peter Timman has pointed out, there was a sure fit of silver on the British market, partly because the Chinese were accepting opium instead of silver in trade from Britain. This was during their time of shame when the soldiers had come and gotten them addicted to opium. In another global trade first, Britain had addicted large numbers of Chinese to the product opium, flooding the market with opium cheaply grown in British controlled India, sometimes shipped in Baltimore clippers built specifically for the opium trade, in shipments sometimes financed by New England merchants and licensed by the East India Company. 1834, wrote Karl Marx in an 1858 article in the New York Daily Tribune, marks an epoch in the history of the opium trade. Britain's East India Company was prohibited from trading in China, and opium was thrown open to separate traders who began smuggling it into China aggressively, increasing the volume of the trade dramatically and demanding silver in return, depleting the celestial empire of the metal as the opium sellers' customers multiplied. So they made them drug addicts. Okay. They made them addicted to opium so that they could rob them of the silver that they had and the wealth that they had. The growth of New England manufacturers, together with the strong exports of cotton, shifted the balance of trade between Britain and the United States somewhat. As silver became cheaper on the British market, more of the silver Britain paid for cotton and other staple crops remained in America instead of being sent back out. That east to west trade winds influenced the economic collapse does not. However, however, make Jackson's ideologically driven recklessness fade to insignificance. The global interconnection went both ways. The revenue derived from American cotton provided conditions for the storm to intensify. Between 1830 and 1836, the number of state chartered banks went from 329 to 730, more than doubling. They issued circulating banknotes and long term bonds. State governments borrowed heavily to finance internal improvements, most of which were never built. From 1834 to 1836, the money supply grew at an average annual rate of 30%, writes Jane Nodell, compared to 2.7% between 1831 and 1834. Canal, railroad, and bank projects all moved forward with deep southern states investing especially heavily in banks. During that time, American indebtedness to foreign creditors doubled from 110 million to 220 million. The state governments were on the hook for much of it. Intended to finance internal improvements, the money flowed through the American economic system. Wealth was made. When it got to the South, it stimulated the market in slaves. Nicholas Biddle rechartered his bank under Pennsylvania state law as the United States Bank of Pennsylvania. Though it was still a giant in terms of capitalization, it was no longer the federal government's agent and no longer had the advantages of national branches. But once again, its most extensive operations outside of Pennsylvania were in Mississippi. Jackson, meanwhile, achieved the conservative dream of paying off the national debt in January 1835. Unfortunately, that left the Treasury empty. Treasury coffers relied on income from tariffs, and now the nullifiers had succeeded in getting the tariffs down, though not removed. There was a sharp drop in federal income, but with the switch to what in theory was a debt free federal government, it was time for some other source of revenue, and the only contender was land sales. There were vast quantities of newly available unplowed land to privatize, and it could only go it couldn't go on indefinitely, but the federal government could take and make lots of money now by selling the Native Americans land cheap, as fast as the natives could be evicted. Having an inside track on this market was valuable. As always with Jacksonians, patronage was crucial to political power. The Jacksonians opened up the floodgates of massive land speculation and currency at about the same time. Between January 1835 and December 1836, some 50,000 square miles were sold at a fixed price of $1.25 an acre. Much of it was snapped up by speculators who flipped it, creating a real estate bubble, while banks issued paper money feverishly. Big banks that were politically allied with the administration to be under the control of the Secretary of Treasury, Levi Woodbury, had the free use of millions of dollars of public money on which they were utterly dependent, as few of them had much in the way of assets otherwise. The Whigs wrote, a 19th century financial historian perceived that the system was exciting wild speculation and that by it money was drawn from the great commercial centers and stored in remote banks to be loaned to the profit of those who had proved their loyalty to the administration and its revered chief. One writer estimated in March of 1837 that banknotes in circulation had increased by $80 million since the veto of the bank charter in 1832. Field hands, meanwhile, might sell for $1,000 or more. So it was clear where economic power resided, in owning slaves. That was where the profit was taken. The gains made in dubious paper were converted into the safer instrument of laboring bodies. So, as you can see, they had a bunch of fake money circulating around the system, and they were recirculating and reprinting this money over and over and over again because different banks could print the money that they wanted to print. And the easiest way for them to hold on to the wealth that they were amassing or acquiring in this time of easy credit and circulating funds was to buy slaves, because slaves locked in the value that they had. So if you had $1,500 in New York, you might only get $700 or $1,000 in New Orleans for that money. So as you were sending your money up and down the river, you would get less and less money. But if you bought a slave in New York for $1,000, you might be able to sell that slave in Mississippi for $1,200, or you might be able to transact that particular. You might be able to do a business transaction and get more money back. But slaves holding it in the bodies of Black people was where they held their wealth. Slave mortgaging was essential to the function of the Southern credit system, but the practice has not been much discussed by historians, and we do not have a good overview of the numbers. No one at the time seems to have compiled statistics on how much mortgaging was being done, whether of land or of slaves. Looking at South Carolina, Bonnie Martin found that year in and year out, private mortgage contracts were quietly filed across the South, but not published tallies but no published tallies exposed the number of mortgages made or the amount of capital raised. The function of banks in the antebellum mortgage market was different than what we think of now. Most antebellum mortgages were funded not by bank capital, but by private individuals and local networks. The credit networks of the time were informal, and often banks were not the lenders, but merely the places of payment, where loans were facilitated by the issuing of paper. Martin writes that of the publicly recorded mortgages that she was able to analyze, Banks, churches, merchants, and building societies were only 19% of the lenders who accepted human collateral in South Carolina. Interpersonal lending accounted for 81%. The financiers and banks made money, of course, and so did the states and municipalities that collected taxes and fees. And though and through the court system, did buying and selling of their own. It's clear that the enslaved collateral was a significant part of the mortgage action, and in the more than 8,000 mortgages she analyzed from Virginia, South Carolina, and Louisiana, Martin found that 41% of them included slaves as all or portion of the collateral raised, 63% of the capital. So again, our bodies locked in their wealth. Our existence made them wealthier because we were an asset that did not depreciate quickly over time. We could transact business. We were used to pay and settle debts. Our bodies were used that way. The price of slaves fluctuated with the rise and fall of cotton, but over the long term, those fluctuations were superficial disturbances of steadily increasing prices. The era between the War of 1812 and secession can be thought of as a divided into two periods of bumpy boom followed by a devastating bust. The first of these booms ended in the complicated series of events remembered as the Panic of 1837, the exact dynamics of which historians have argued about ever since. After what we now call a dead cat bounce in 1838, the economy in 1839 crashed a second time, harder, landing in a depression that bottomed out in 1842 and did not immediately recover. By then, more than 200 banks had failed, but for the strongest, most disciplined traders, there was still business to be done. In a letter of November 16, 1839, that somehow wound up in print in an abolitionist tract of 1846, the small scale slave trader G.W. Barnes of Halifax, North Carolina, informed the big trader Theophilus Freeman of New Orleans of the names and prices at which he had shipped 6 girls to him. Then wrote, "I have a great many Negroes offered to me, but I will not pay the prices they ask, for I know they will come down. I have no opposition in the market. I will wait until I hear from you before I buy, and then I can judge what I must pay. Write often, as the times are critical, and it depends on the prices you get to govern me in buying." The stimulus that got the economy pumping again was provided by the annexation of Texas in 1845 from Mexico, which stimulated the slave trade. It accelerated further the discovery of gold in California in 1848 and the increasing penetration of railroads and roads along with cotton to new heights. It dipped briefly with a panic of 1857 that was caused in part, thought Natchez planter Benjamin Wales, by riverlands at most unwarrantable prices and Negroes at $1,500, though the South was actually the least affected by the downturn. Then the slave trade went higher than ever, reaching unheard of levels by 1860. The boom ended with secession, though the trade continued and even accelerated during the first 3 years of the war. But by then, there was no longer any reliable money with which to compare prices because the Confederacy was not part of the US financial system. Not without a sense of irony, we will use white supremacists and one time dominant in the field of slavery historian Ulrich B. Phillips data showing prices in four major slave markets, not including Natchez, the highest priced slave market, large market. While Phillips' racist conclusions are thoroughly discredited, his numbers in this case are based on examining 3,000 plus bills of sale have been more or less generally accepted. As visually estimated by Robert Evans Jr. from Phillips Graphs, the curve of 5-year slave prices for prime male field hands looks like this. From 1830 to 1835, the prices in Richmond were $5.29. The number in Charleston were $5.92. In mid-Georgia, it was $883. And in New Orleans, it was $942, so almost twice the number in Richmond. From 1836 to 1840, in Richmond, it was 910 slaves. In Charleston, it was 1,053. In mid-Georgia, it was 1,115. And in New Orleans, it was 1,205. Then from 1841 to 1845, the numbers dropped. It was 530 in Richmond, 590 in Charleston, 685 in mid-Georgia, 745 in New Orleans. From 1846 to 1850, there were 650 in Richmond, 730 in Charleston, 870 in mid-Georgia, and 935 in New Orleans. From 1851 to 1855, it was 835 in Richmond, 930 in Virginia, 1,180 in mid-Georgia, and 1,250 in New Orleans. And from 1856 to 1860, at the height as the war was getting ready to begin, there were 1,100 in Richmond, 1,150 in Charleston, 1,565 in mid-Georgia, and 1,605 in New Orleans. The effect of the post-1837 depression is clearly visible here, as is the economic tonic effect of annexing Texas in 1845. We see an impressive price rise over the 15 years from 1845 to 1860, especially in Georgia, but a deeper wave was building that only broke with the ruin of war. Slave prices inflated continuously as compared with the price of cotton the slaves produced. Here are Phillips' figures for the Georgia Cotton Belt, which incidentally give a sense of how profitable slave trading was. The importation of Africans was no longer possible. The supply of African Americans into the market could not keep pace with the amount of new cotton acreage continually being brought under cultivation. So the demand for labor always exceeded the supply. The degree of inflation slowed in hard times, but even then the trend was upward. The price of a prime field hand expressed in pounds of ginned cotton. In 1800, it was 1,500. In 1809, it was 3,000 pounds. In 1818, it was 3,500 pounds. In 1826, it was 5,400 pounds. In 1837, it was 10,000 pounds. In 1845, it was 12,000 pounds. And in 1860, just as the war was getting underway, it was 15,000 to 18,000 pounds of cotton per field hand. At these intervals, we see no depression, only slowed growth. The price of a field hand in Georgia fell from 1,300 to 650 between 1837 and 1845. But measured against the price of cotton over the course of those years, the field hand appreciated in value from 10,000 pounds of cotton to 12,000 pounds of cotton. Over the 6 decades of antebellum slavery, even as agricultural innovations gradually increased per hand productivity, slave labor was steadily becoming a more valuable property than the staple crops of the land produced. I want you to note that they say over the 6 decades of antebellum slavery, as though slavery only lasted 6 years. They're only saying that because what they're saying is that they only monitored slavery from 1800 to 1860. They're not talking about uh, pre-independence slavery. They're not talking about slavery that happened post-independence. They're not talking about anything other than the small window, the 60-year period in which they had expansionist policies and the African slave trade ended and the intra-American slave trade began. The mere fact of holding slaves then brought substantial capital gains. The pressure of this curve, as we need not remind our readers, was felt in unsubtle ways by enslaved women who were pressured to bear children. Newborn Black babies were worth more on paper all the time. Their poor life expectancy, actuarialized through traders' firsthand experience of discounting the substantial death rates. William Dusenberry believes that almost 46% of slave children died before reaching the age of 15, compared with a 28% mortality rate for free children. The higher mortality rate is no mystery, and it was needlessly high, as it turned on planters' reluctance to spend on the health and welfare of the enslaved. Even clean drinking water was sometimes seen as an unnecessary expense, which might explain the higher death rates of the enslaved from cholera. Good water is far more essential than many suppose, wrote a planter, signing himself a citizen of Mississippi, in an article about plantation management titled The Negroes in DeBow's Review of March 1847, or than I would or than I could be persuaded myself until within a few years. Cistern water was not too cold. Cistern water not too cold will on any plantation save enough in doctor's fees to refund the extra expense. But money spent on slaves' welfare came right out of the plantation's immediate profits. Some planters who could take the longer view, those who were not being ground down by debt, could see that any money that was spent on the health and welfare of the enslaved was of direct economic benefit to the slave owner and could also be cited as proof of the slave owner's purported kindness to his captives. The great object, continued the Mississippi planter, is to prevent disease and prolong the useful laboring period of the Negro's life. Thus, does interest point out the humane course. The word humane was frequent in use in slave owner vocabulary. On some large estates, children were taken off the various different parcels of land away from their parents and raised together in a collective nursery that made easily visible the slave breeding nature of the Southern slavery project. A planter in North Carolina told the British geologist Charles Lyell in 1842 that given the frequent necessity of breaking up families for sale, that he defended the custom of bringing up the children of the same estate in common, as it was far more humane not to cherish domestic ties among slaves. That is, since domestic ties were only going to be broken anyway, it was better to not create them in the first place. Labor that was capital had no family. Despite its shorter than average lifespan, the enslaved Black population of the South grew faster than the white population and faster than the small population of the free people of color. The capitalized wombs of the South supplied boys who were sold to traders, who sold them to planters, so they could produce the cotton that would feed the steam driven mills of Britain, France, and even New England. And they supplied girls who could pick as much cotton as boys and who would themselves become captive baby makers. The slave breeding industry was going full tilt. So, as you can see, they figured out a way to ensure that enslaved populations didn't have family ties. When you think about some of the writings of that time, of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who talks about the fact that these particular enslaved people didn't have any family, they didn't have any customs, they didn't have any connections one to another. You can see that these people ensured that we were seen as property, as stock, as animals. You can see that they didn't have any desire for us to be anything other than money producing, capital raising interests for them. Investing in a girl was like investing in a continual interest bearing account because she could make more slaves. You can see that they had all types of nefarious intent when it came to how they dealt with the Chinese. This is not me sympathizing or empathizing with them, but this is me telling you that I don't have a lot of empathy or sympathy for their fentanyl problems because what's happening to them is just what they've done to other people. And we can see that America loves a populist strongman. This has been who they are for generations. They have always loved a populist strongman. So Trump is no different today from what they have historically picked in the past. They continue to pick this character because it's who they are at their core. It's who the Americans are. And there are some sick, non Black people and Black people, Black looking people, that have decided that it is better to side with the populist movement and to accept the rhetoric of a rabid racist than it is to fight politically for what they believe in, for what's right, for what's fair, for what's just. I want to thank Anthony McPhail and the Forecast for listening. I know that Sister Ra and the elders are listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. KW Don 7 is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. And so many others. And you. Yes, you, dear listener. I appreciate you for listening and being with us tonight. I will be back on Thursday reading from Niggas to Gods, where we talk about how we can transform ourselves and some of the problems that we have run into. I value each and every one of you. Thank you for your gifts and donations into this particular broadcast. I value each and every one of you, and I appreciate you. I will see you soon. Peace, guys.